Okay, I think we're got the record. Okay, so Lana, this is for you today. We're recording the discussion and hope you're feeling better soon. Today, Ben will be presenting, so I'll have a word of prayer. He'll present, and then we'll discuss it together. All right? Thank you, Lord, for restoring Jade to better health, and do pray for Lana that you'd continue to strengthen her and encourage her these days, and give her good health over the weekend and recovery. Pray for Ben as he presents today, that you would use his presentation to stimulate our thinking and to give us a greater appreciation for what you're doing around the world. I pray in Jesus' name, amen. All right, Ben, hand it to you and flip it on there, and you're good to go.
All right. I'm shooting for 20 minutes?
Yeah,
roughly.
About that.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, well, in kind of researching for this project, I wanted to pick a topic that I was interested in, that was intriguing to me. And so I was looking for several articles, and I found one article that I found to be really intriguing and just something that I had thought about and read about in a few other places. And the topic is about how technology has affected missions, just overall in the past, several decades. And I found this one article. It's called "How Technology Has Affected and Is Affecting Mission" by the author Tim Young. I don't know if any of you have heard about him. He is a field consultant with Lightside Technology Services, which is a company that helps IT personnel and mission agencies to help set up computers and interacting with the missionaries and just helping them and providing services for them. And in his article, he talks about the different ways that technology has affected missions. And he has a lot of experience working with missionaries. I think he said in the article that he's worked with over 100 mission agencies and with 13 different countries. And so he has a lot of hands-on experience. He's traveled to a lot of these places, and he's seen a lot of ways that people have had to kind of maneuver around obstacles for technology. Like in one place, he says that they had to operate with computers and stuff using only 2 hours of electricity a day. Like that's all they got in that area. Another spot where it flooded and they had to get all this computer stuff figured out. So anyway, he talks about just his experiences with that. And this article was published about a decade ago. So technology-wise, it's a little bit out of date. But I found that there were some pretty good principles and ideas that he brought up that I just wanted to talk about today. So he talks about this topic, and he brings up how technology has affected missions. And he starts off just by asking the question, like, what is technology? In that article, he says that when many people refer to technology, they're referring to the most recent advances in technology. And technology, in the realm of technology, it's always changing. It's ever changing, and there are constantly updates and advances that people make, innovations. And in the article, he talks about how he traces from the beginning in about 1970, 1980. He talks about how there was a strong push to translate the Bible into every language. And a lot of Christians were wanting to do that, but the challenge was they didn't know every language that was out there. And so there was a strong push to kind of research that, and computers were able to work through that information, collect that data, and help them in that translating process. And what used to take, he said, about 15 to 20 years to translate a language, with the help of technology and computers and those resources, takes maybe 2 and 3 years, depending on the language, of course. So he also gives several examples of even how airplane travel, email, and computers have aided missionary work. And so as in the 1970s and 80s, as they're pushing for this these advances in technology, people found many different ways to even go beyond that. And one of the main things that he talks about, one of the main benefits of technology in missions is simply the communication factor. So the communication between the sending church and the local churches, the supporting churches, and the missionaries on the field. Like, you just think of how Skype, email, now Zoom, and all these different things have aided in the communication process. He also mentioned several issues that come about with technology, and the more technologically advanced you get, the more capable you need to be to understand and work them. And that was a challenge that he and his ministry, his company, helps to train missionaries in understanding and working on that technology, working through the computers. And he says, quote, "Finding a good computer person in a mission organization is very difficult." And he says this is because few techie people are called to full-time ministry. And one thing that he suggests, and I'm not sure what I think about it yet, I'm still kind of thinking through it, and that's one of the things that I wanted to bring up even today, is that he argues that those going into full-time ministry shouldn't only study at a Bible college or in seminary, but also go and take computer classes and learn how to function and work with technology and kind of equip themselves in that way. And I see benefit in that, but I think, especially in today's world, with the ease that we have to find help, like on the internet, whether it be a tutorial video or just contacting someone, I think it's a little bit easier for people on the field to simply do that instead of going through, a lot of these computer classes. So we could talk about that later, but that's just one thing that I found to be a little interesting. But needless to say, the rest of this argument was pretty good. I agree that with what he says, that technology is a tool that we've been given, and it's something that we could use to be effective in our ministry. And Young states it in this way, quote, "Technology is a tool through which we do a task, and mission is the task that we're currently talking about," end quote. And I think that though technology has brought many challenges, it could be used for a greater effectiveness if we understand that we need to be good stewards of what we've been given, and the challenges that come up, we must face them and realize that we must respond to them in a correct way. And that just reminded me of what Jesus says in Luke 12, "To whom much has been given, from him much will be required." So we've been given the great use of technology, and we need to use that and steward that as we move forward. So now I just want to kind of talk about the three different ways that he talks about how missions has affected and benefited missionaries. So in the simple area of travel, airplanes have become kind of the staple travel tool to get to faraway countries and stuff like that. And it's one of the easiest, the most common things now. And now you could, get tickets online. You could book flights. You could book hotels, plan and navigate your route. You could estimate when you're arriving, and just all that communication is facilitated through the use of technology. And it has opened up a lot of opportunities for even short-term missions, whereas before, if you were going somewhere, you really had a commitment to be there for a good while. Whereas now, you could be there for short amounts of time and still get there and get back easily. Another way that he talks about in this article is communication. We've touched on this, and technology has provided just a plethora of opportunities for that. And in today's world, a missionary on one side of the world can instantaneously message their church back home, asking for prayer or whatever the case may be. And it's a really big benefit to have that close means of communication between them. And the missionaries feel like much more a part of the ministry of their sending church if they could communicate easily that way. It lessens the sense of distance that they have. Young sums it up in this way. All this allows the church to treat the remote missionaries as if they're part of the local congregation, to pray for them when they're hurting, to offer words of support when they're needed, to help their financial needs, and many other things. And there are other ways that this was surprising to me, that missions has affected technology and the advancements of that. So a while back, email was kind of separated in a few different segments, and they weren't able to communicate with each other in those segments. And then a group of Christians wanting to be able to connect those segments and communicate with their missionaries figured out a system, he calls it the email internet gateway, where it connected those systems. And so that was one way that Christians impacted even something like email, which is so common today. And so I just thought that was interesting, and just how even missions has affected technology in that way. Now I just want to think about and talk about the ramifications that technology has had and just the challenges that could come from them. And while it's true that technology has helped free up a lot of time for the missionaries, there are a lot more opportunities now to spend that time poorly, especially with social media and all these different streaming services and online internet stuff that comes up. And it's been observed that newer missionaries, as they go to the field, there's a temptation to fall back on what's known and what's comfortable, instead of going out and adapting to the new culture. And so there's a temptation for missionaries when they get there to go and stay in their house and be super connected back home through the internet, and yet not be effectively serving and connecting with the people who are physically there with them. And this type of reclusive action can stunt the growth and adaptation that they have to that new culture. And if they become too engulfed with their comforts of home, there's very limited opportunities and ways that they can interact with other people. And it's a danger that even we, who aren't missionaries in one sense of the word, have to deal with. There's a danger in just being lay people in the church. And so that's something that we need to guard ourselves from. But one thing that was an encouragement to me was the author of this article tells about a time where he's seen how technology has worked very well in the church. So he tells about a time when he went to a prayer meeting, and he was attending, and they were making an announcement about a plane crash. And many of the people knew the pilot. They gave details about the plane crash, and I think a few people died in that plane crash. And the people in the church knew the passengers, they knew the pilot, and there was a close connection between them. But they weren't thinking consciously about, okay, how did they get this information? Because it's just so natural now, where they received the information. It was a combination of email, online newspapers, and even a YouTube video that they got this information from. But sharing it in the church was a good thing, because they were able to pray specifically and quickly for this situation. And Young puts it this way, quote, "The focus was on ministry, not the technology that enabled it to happen smoothly," end quote. This is how I think that technology should operate in missions. It should be a tool that we use and not distract from the ministry itself. And I just think of all the ways that missionaries use, and in some cases rely on, technology to communicate and operate on the mission field. And there are many ways that technology has now just become an integral part of missions, and it has opened up so many opportunities for them on the field that were previously impossible to do. But I think overall, the conclusion that I came to was that this technology is the gift that God has given us, and it's a tool that we could use to be greater at serving and being effective on the mission field, but still keeping in mind the dangers that we have for it. So I don't know if you guys have any questions on that. I do want to bring up a few things later on, but if there are any questions. What did you guys think of that idea of missionaries getting kind of that computer training in addition to theological training? Yeah? One thing, well, this is kind of the ministry that this guy has in going to the missionaries and helping them train. And he mentioned that for the older generation, it's a little bit harder for them to learn and adjust to the new technologies, and even for the younger generation too. But they tend to adapt more quickly to it. And so I see that that's true, that there is a need to understand that technology. And I think a lot more people living in today's world are now adapting a lot more to it. And so there's even more of a understanding of it than previously was. Do you want me to move down there so we could record the conversation?
The actual content?
Yeah.
Yeah, come on down.
Okay.
Bring it down here and pull your chair out. We'll kind of all face each other, so none of us just sit back of our heads. I had a question for you. Just, I mean, you asked that question about, studying, doing computer study. It seems like most of the people that go to the mission field are college graduates. Not everybody. I wonder if he would be satisfied with the kind of computer. I mean, almost every college student is messing with computers, right? Assignments and on-campus technology. I wonder if he would consider that kind of exposure sufficient, or if he's looking at something beyond that.
He made it sound like going to some computer science school and taking classes about that, like a more profound than just say like a general knowledge of computers and stuff. So he made it sound more in-depth than that.
Can I ask you guys another question then? You mentioned earlier in the discussion, your presentation, the possibility of computers being a distraction. So I guess a nice point of discussion would be, how do we know on the mission field when our use of our use of technology is becoming a distraction rather than a benefit?
I guess in ministry, if technology becomes a distraction, your congregation will see it. If you're more interested in how to present, how it looks on the screen, like for us when we do our PowerPoints, we want it to look just right, not worried about like the content. So when you start to think about some of those things, or I need to make this social media post to do this, but in all reality, you just made a post that really means nothing to somebody. And so I guess when those become more important than the people you're ministering to. So that's what I would say.
This wasn't from this particular article, but I did look up a few more articles about this topic and kind of learned a little bit more. And I'm not going to be able to remember the name. There's this one guy, he's written a book called, I think it's 12 Ways My Phone is Changing Me or something like that. And he talks a lot about this concept of how technology is negatively affecting missionaries on the field. And I listened to a podcast from him too, and he talked about just the challenges that having a greater access to technology has just distracted from the ministry, personal ministry, from one person to the other person, instead of being engulfed in this mini world that you have, in your phone or in your computer or just in that. And so in that area, he talks a lot about how we need to even regulate our time and our use of that and find the balance. And is this really affecting, my ministry, affecting the church, affecting my family life? And so there are so many implications and applications that could come out of that. But that was just like an additional thing that I read looking through these articles that this guy had. And my dad recommended him. I talked to him a little bit about that. So.
Can I ask another question then related to this? Related to the subject of distractions, is it okay for a missionary on the field to make use of technology that is above the pay scale and ability of the nationals to use, and why or why not? You bring down a projector, they can't afford a projector, you're using some form of technology they can't afford. Are we justified in doing that or not? Why or why not?
I think it really depends on the location and the culture of the people, especially if it's a culture where they're a little more resistant to change and they're not willing to invest in something like that, or if it's a culture where they really have no experience with that technology whatsoever. And that's where I could see where it could be definitely a distraction, because they're just so focused on like, wow, look at this great missionary coming with this great technology that we've never seen before, that we don't have the money to buy, and it kind of loses the idea that he's simply just a messenger bringing a message to the people. Instead, he becomes kind of the focus of the ministry. But I do think that it can definitely be a big help to a lot of ministries where they just have like they just have a big building, and it's just full of just tons and tons and tons of people, and they might not even have microphones, so having even just like a projector where they can put up verses or songs and things like that, I think like very fundamental stuff like that can be very useful. But you just got to be mindful, I guess, of the fact that when you leave, they may not still have that sort of thing. So
Yeah, I think there could be that danger of creating too much of a divide between all the super technological missionary coming in with all this tech, and then the people who may not use that in their culture or may not be something that they're into. And so I think there's a danger in having too much of that divide. But I think what Jade said is good, like having some basics and having, like in the article, he talked about how in one place where they only get like 2 hours of electricity a day. And so even just using that, the missionaries would use that, I think, only for communication back home, usually, and maybe just a few other projects. And so that's not necessarily impacting the nationals there in a way that they would find offensive or something like that. So
Another comment on that. Sometimes nationals can also almost become resentful of you, or they look at you like you're the big, and it could almost turn them off. I mean, if our goal as missionaries is to mentor disciples, then the idea is for disciples to be able to do what we have taught them to do. And if they are unable to use some of the technology that we have, they may in their minds think that they're unable to do the ministry that we're doing because they can't do it the way. In other words, they don't just learn what to do, they learn how to do it. That's part of discipleship. And if the way that they learn it involves technology they can't afford, then it could, in their minds, translate into a ministry that they cannot do. And so I think that in Brazil, there were times I had to hold off. When I was teaching in Brazil for a while, I mean, I remember when video projectors were just coming out here, and very few churches even here had them. But some missionaries were starting to get them, and I thought, man, that'd be so cool in the classroom to be able to use them, or in the seminary where I was teaching. But I just didn't feel right about it. I held back. And the next time I went home on furlough, things had changed in both countries, and I was able to take a projector back with me and use it, without feeling like I was way beyond their ability to use. Even some of the churches in Brazil were beginning to use projectors in their churches by that time. It was just a lot more appropriate.
I think like with thinking about that, you can't introduce too much technology too early too. When you're learning with the culture and learning these people, and they're also learning you can't introduce them to things that they don't understand. You have to learn them and see what would fit into the ministry in terms of technology, whether that's maybe getting a projector so that you could have more Bible verses up, or putting songs up there, or that's getting stuff for a school. You have to practice a lot of discernment of like, what do we actually need in terms of technology? Will this be harmful to our ministry, or will this be helpful? And so those are a lot of things you have to think about, especially if you like pair with schools, whether that's the younger kids or even if you're doing for seminary. So you have to look at basically the needs of the people, not just what will make my ministry easier.
I'm going to try to think of a question. So, I mean, most recently with the pandemic, Zoom has kind of, taken off. And I don't know if any of you guys have any opinions on this, but do you think, because like I know my church back home in Chile has met on Zoom. They've had to do that with the restrictions that they've had down there. And so how has the virtual church, what are some of the implications that maybe could come from that? Like, I know this is kind of a very broad question, but does anyone have any thoughts on that?
I think a lot of the implications I saw, and this was mainly just from some of the small churches I helped out with, is their numbers went down. So people were not like, when everything was able to open back up, where you could have small amount of number of people in churches, or you could go to church with a mask on, a lot of people would just stay home because technology just made it easier. They don't have to move. They can go sit and be in church in their pajamas. Like, they don't have to try to get a whole bunch of kids ready. It kind of made it to where people were like, oh, I'll just watch church. I don't really need to go. And I think for a lot of just the number of churches, and even a lot of churches closed because of it, because they weren't getting the number of people to even have a ministry survive. Like, even with the technology costs and of that, they weren't able to survive during the pandemic.
Well, for my church here in Perry, Iowa, we definitely had to do a lot of like Zoom meetings especially when the pandemic was really bad, and there were like obviously weeks where we didn't meet at all just because of basically a total lockdown. But when things opened up and we were able to meet again, we still had the same number of people that we had before, but we had this kind of like growing base of like people that would watch it like just on our Facebook Live or something like that. And through that, we were able to see like at least like 3 or 4 families like come and check out our church, and they're currently, still visiting right now because of it. So to me, I can see the Zoom live streams kind of being beneficial in a way, because it kind of provides like, I don't know, kind of like this way for people to visit a church, like, but if they have like some sort of either past like experience with church that wasn't so great, or they're just kind of shy and they don't know like, you know, how it is or anything like that. It's kind of a way to kind of get their feet a little wet before they come visit. I know that there is that danger that, you know, you would have people in your church kind of like drop off from attendance and kind of just stick to the Zoom. But I think if churches are maintaining that kind of hard doctrine that, you know, we're going to assemble when we're going to assemble, and that means being there physically, I think the core members, the people that, you know, are really dedicated, really in it for the ministry, you know, they'll be there, despite all those sorts of things that happen. So to me, when I see the fact that like a lot of churches are, you know, they're seeing a lot of their attendance drop off, or people switch churches, a lot of it I think is up to personal discretion, because, you know, if you're dedicated to a ministry and you have a ministry that, you know, you're doing for your church, which you should, you'll be there. You know, you'll still make time, or you'll still have that sort of want to do it, even if it's a little bit more tempting to be on Zoom. So I don't know. I kind of almost see it as like a very beneficial thing, because I think something like that kind of switches things up for people, and it makes it a little bit harder for churches to, I guess, like fly under the radar in terms of who's dedicated to ministry and who's not. So I don't really think it should be a cry of like, oh man, we're losing people in our church. It should be more like, well, now we know who's actually committed to the church. So there's a lot more ministry there, I guess. But especially with my church, our church sort of had a reputation of being like the bad church in town because of some past leadership. So it's definitely opened up sort of a way to show that our church is not as bad as it seems. Because honestly, the whole live stream is just our singing and our worship and our pastor preaching. And so we kind of just let that kind of be the representation of what our church is, not just the sign, or not just, you know, our name. So kind of helps with building rapport, I guess, in the community. So.
Yeah, those are good comments. I think when the pandemic broke out, very few pastors hesitated regarding the viability and necessity of using Zoom or some other platform. Everybody wanted people to be able to continue to connect. The challenge came at the tail end of it. I mean, well, maybe we're not at the tail end of it, but you know what I mean? When people were starting to go back, now pastors are scratching their heads and saying, okay, do I unplug this thing now? Technology has a way of establishing a plateau that you really can't go back on. Or you can, but it's hard. Because if you unplug the live streaming, then, you know, in some people's eyes, you're cutting them off now, you know, from the preaching. And of course, sometimes that's just an excuse for going to church in your pajamas, you know, for not going to church in your pajamas. And so I think there's a good lesson in that, and that is whatever the technologies you're using, understand that when you upgrade, you're probably going to have a very hard time ever going back to what you did before. So are you ready for that? Are you prepared to maintain that? Same thing with the standard of living on the field. Once you present that to the nationals, for them to go back to something less than that, it's going to be very, very difficult to do.
I just also wanted to add quickly that because of the new implementation of like the Zoom live streaming, and pretty much like every church I've seen has implemented it in some sort of way. And so it's kind of opened up also the ability to be able to just like watch other churches like worship services as well. Like I've been able to watch my friend Andrew's churches like live stream from their church all the way over in California, and just kind of see how they worship and see what they kind of do. So I just think that's cool that, you know, you don't have to travel 1,000 miles away to go and see, you know, how a person's church is doing. So in terms of that, I really like Zoom for that reason. But I mean, there's always a limit to using those sorts of things. So.
Do you like technology? Are you a technology guy? Is that what drew you to this article, or?
Well, a little bit, yeah. I wouldn't say I'm well versed in a lot of like the super techie stuff, but I've just seen how technology has been used like on the field, and just like how churches one of the major things that kind of attracted me to it was the communication aspect, just feeling like you're more connected with your sending church because they call you, or that aspect of it. And so I was just intrigued and wanted to see kind of how that has affected missions just in the past 50 years or so.
I remember when email first became a thing, and it was my mother-in-law, of all people, that said, "Have you heard of this new thing called email?" This is in the early 90s. Now, it was already out probably, and so we were in Northeast Brazil, and we had to dial up to Rio, way down south, and it was the old rotary dial. And there's beep, 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 and you're on, and our first modem was 14.4K. That was the speed of our modem. Sending a small document took 10, 15 minutes. I mean, but it was a big deal. Then they came out with 14.8K. Woo! And I mean, so you're talking what? That's in the 90s, 20, it's 30 years ago now. But just impressed me of how much things have changed, how quickly. Yeah. You guys have any more questions or any comments?
I just have a question. Yeah. So, like, in terms of like technology and with the article that he wrote, did he sort of discuss anything to do with like differing cultures and how they sort of implement technology within their own cultures, or was it just sort of more directed towards like people in ministry or people going into ministry?
He didn't discuss too much about the different cultures. He briefly kind of gave a few moments of experience when he was in other cultures and how they use technology. But his primary focus in the article was just discussing those three things, like travel, communication, and like the ministry opportunities for like evangelism and stuff on the internet. So those were his primary topics.
All set? Anything else? That was good. All right. Excellent. Good start. This is what we're looking for. And, our plan will be to resume on Monday. Now, did you say that you could do Monday? Okay, Lana, Kenzie has said that if you're still not well enough to do your report on Monday, she can swap with you on that. So let me know, let Kenzie know. Maybe you can keep in touch with Lana, and the two of you kind of keep each other up on. But appreciate your willingness to pinch hit if that's the case.
Just got back and
Well, you're right. You'd be a week from Monday, so there's still quite a bit of time for. Yeah, because refresh starts on Tuesday night. Yeah. Yep. All right. Hey, well, appreciate that. This is good. This is what we're looking at. Yeah, it's always nice when you have a group where everybody can participate a little bit. So I'll shut the recording off here and good to go.